I have been on a personal journey, and I've been talking to a lot of uh, brilliant people, all brothers in Christ. That is my foundational starting point, that the gospel is the answer to every problem in society, every problem in the world. So that's foundational. And on that, I've been doing a lot of listening because the topic of race, which I'm even going to question that term here today, especially after Friday's interview. If you missed my interview with Daniel Hill, check that out. We got to get to the solutions here. I feel like in my lifetime, I'm 50 years old, and I grew up, taught to treat everybody like people, and so some of the tension that's I've seen over the course of my life is a little foreign to me personally, and I think it's where some of the disconnect is the way I live my life and the problems I see out there in our country. I have a hard time relating to sometimes. And it's not to say that I'm this great, wonderful person, because Lord knows I grew up with jokes that I would not tell you right now because they would be offensive to a lot of people and some things like that. So, but as far as, I don't know, when I saw the George Floyd thing, I thought, good God, what's going on in our country? There's just been several things over the years where you go, what? Are those aberrations? Or do we have a deeper problem here? And I don't know. So we're going to have a conversation today. And right now I've been looking forward to this actually for a while. He doesn't know this, but Jemar Tisby is a gentleman that's with me live right now. And a Notre Dame graduate, MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary. He's the president of an organization called The Witness, which is a Black Christian collective. He's a writer, he's an author. I'll show you his his current book right there. It's called The Color of Compromise, and the subtitle is The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. So that ought to get your attention. He's got another book coming out early 2021 dealing with this issue too. But Jemar Tisby is with me. Jemar, so glad you could be with me today. Thank you for your time.
I'm grateful for the invitation. Looking forward to our conversation.
So I have tons of questions, and we'll get into some of those. But start me off a little bit with just kind of where you're at in the journey you've been on and the things you've seen, and just kind of where we're at as Christians in this country.
So my story begins, at least in my conception. God had a plan long before I was aware of it, but I became a Christian in high school, and it was through the ministry of a white evangelical youth group. And so from the very beginning of my faith journey, issues of race have been very prominent because mostly in those early days, I was one of the fewer or the only person of color in those fellowships, whether at the youth group or the churches I attended. So it's been a long journey, and I can tell you that everything that I have to say is contextual to a lived experience. And so you mentioned, having a particular experience growing up and sort of leaning into these issues now. Well, I've had some very personal and quite honestly painful issues related to race and the church. And so that really picked up when I was in seminary, as you mentioned, and I started a couple of initiatives when I was in seminary. One was a student initiative to recruit more Black students to the school, but also to equip students of any race for cross-cultural ministry. The other is what you also mentioned, The Witness. We started that in the fall of 2011. And so that's when I sort of began publicly writing and speaking and teaching about these things. And ever since then, I've been on this journey to try to help, I hope, the church grow in race relations, in our understanding of what Christ has already put in place when he tore down the dividing wall of hostility. And so that's what my life's work has been. And in recent times, I've gotten into history. So I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of Mississippi. That's really where the genesis of this book is. It was through the coursework as part of this degree that I was running across all of these stories that even if they weren't, even if the book wasn't about Christianity, if it mentioned Christianity, oftentimes it was a very disappointing and tragic history of how Christians, instead of confronting racism, were often complicit with it or compromised with it.
So let me ask you a little bit about that. And by the way, chat is open if you have a question for me or for my guest, Jemar Tisby. If it's a good question, I'll pass it along. But so I've studied, some history too. Not probably not the level you have. I have no advanced degrees in history. So, but just saying, looking back, I see both. I see the church on both sides. Slavery, in the abolitionist movement, Underground Railroad, all the way up through civil rights, and even into today. I see both. So how do we? What's your kind of take on the church when you talk about its role in the history all the way up through today when it comes to this issue?
So we have a terrible time remembering, in general, whatever the issue is. But what we do remember, we tend not to have a hard time remembering the good stuff. And so when it comes to the history of race in the church, I apologize.
That's all right. They're not coming for you, are they?
No,
All right.
thankfully. It's a just fire truck. Anyway, when it comes to the history of race in the church, we don't have a hard time remembering the people who fought against racism these days. And so people are quick to point to folks like John Newton and William Wilberforce. And I also think, folks have begun appropriating the legacy of the Black church and how Black churches and Christians fought against racism and slavery and white supremacy. The problem is when that is sort of the abundance of what we talk about, we overlook the fact that these were the exceptions more than the rule. And when they did it, when they resisted these things, they faced incredible opposition. There's a great book called Born of Conviction, which is about a small group of white Methodist ministers in the civil rights movement who wrote a statement and publicized it in the newspapers, condemning segregation and advocating for Black civil rights. Well, within a matter of a year or two, all but one of those Methodist ministers had been driven not only out of their churches, but out of the state.
Jeez.
And so what we need to recognize is yes, it's both that Christianity was a force of liberation and freedom and equity, but also when people stood up for that, they faced incredible opposition, oftentimes from other Christians as well. So I wanted to highlight that part that we don't remember or misremember.
Yeah, well, and to experience, which I understand has limited scope in the grand scheme of things, but my dad was a stadium preacher back in the '60s. Billy Graham would do the one giant stadium. Well, my dad would do 3, 4, 5 nights at a football stadium in a town across the South, and he faced it. He had churches that were a part of his crusades that would say you need to segregate, and he flat out refused. And he got a little belligerent because he's that way. And one time they were going to, it was an ugly scene, and he said, "Fine, we'll segregate," and he put all the Black people right up front.
Wow.
so yeah, I mean, we have in America I gotta watch my language. We have a really awful history in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to those who were dragged here in chains from Africa and their descendants. So no argument there. Do you think we made some progress? Where do you think we are now?
Yes, we've made progress. The recently deceased John Lewis answered this question a year or two ago and basically said, if you don't believe we've made progress, then just look at my history and my life, from getting his skull fractured on the Edmund Pettus Bridge to being a congressman. So in many ways, there's been advancement. And I think to fail to recognize progress is also to fail to recognize the struggle and sacrifice of many people who've been advocating for equity and liberty for a long time.
Yeah.
Voting rights are under assault in many ways, but ostensibly, everyone who's a citizen has the right to vote, which is a massive shift just from the Jim Crow era.
Yeah.
Certainly, I wouldn't be talking to you today if we hadn't had emancipation. And so, obviously, that's a huge sign of progress. But obviously, there's still a lot to go, and that's one of the reasons why I advocate that Christians in particular, but the nation in general, should celebrate and commemorate Juneteenth. So
I'm from Texas. I know about that.
yes, yes, yes. You all, the folks in Texas originated. It's the oldest celebration of Black emancipation in the country, and it's also, I think, if we celebrate it as a nation, it's an opportunity to do a few things. Number one, it's an opportunity to look back and assess the wickedness of the institution of race-based chattel slavery. Like, we have to remember that, and there's a whole lot of misremembering or ignorance about what race-based chattel slavery actually was and how it was practiced.
Mm-hmm.
But secondly, and this is the fun part, we actually get to celebrate progress. The fact that those chains did fall and that institution was abolished. And that is something worth celebrating. That is progress in our nation.
Yes.
And then the third thing that we get to do is we get to assess where we are now and what we still have to do.
Yeah.
So even as we celebrate progress, even as we look at the history, that's 160 years ago. What about now? And so occasions such as Juneteenth allow us to say, okay, we've come a long way, but where yet do we still have to go?
And I agree with everything you just said. Yeah, where do we still have to go? I think that's one of the questions on a lot of people's minds, and a lot where the debate is, frankly.
Yes, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Here's the thing. One of the things I say in The Color of Compromise is that racism never goes away. It just adapts. The reason, so I would say there are three sort of obvious manifestations of racism in U.S. history. One is race-based chattel slavery. The second is Jim Crow segregation and all the inequality that came from it. Now, a lot of people would stop right there and say, well, with the end of Jim Crow, that could be 1954 Brown v. Board, that could be 1964 Voting Rights Act, wherever you want to place it. A lot of people would say, well, that was the end of racism on a broad scale in the United States. Well, I have a different perspective. Racism adapts. Racism changes forms. And so in the book, I have some quotes from people who say, well, you can't be as explicit. You can't say the N-word. You can't say black. You can't say white. You can't refer to race. But here's ways to get at how to distribute power and not use those words. Here's ways to get around it. It's called, dog whistles, where you can only hear it if you hear it, but it's there. So I would say that era post Jim Crow is we're living in a racialized society, a term from sociologists Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. And the reason why racism never goes away, it just adapts too. On a theological level, we know that we're never going to reach perfection on this side of heaven. So until Jesus returns, we're always going to be dealing with sin and brokenness and imperfection. On a second level, racism never goes away, it just adapts because there's a narrative that has remained consistent. And it's the narrative about race. It's the narrative about racial difference. Others call it white supremacy, which I know is a trigger word for a lot of people. But if you just think of it in terms of the stories we tell ourselves about race, that's been consistent. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, said the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. And that's why we're having discussions to this day about the appropriateness of things like Confederate monuments. So until that narrative changes, then we're going to continue to see manifestations of racism. It'll just look different in 2020 than it did in 1920, and we should not be surprised at that.
We're talking to Jemar Tisby. This is his website, jemartisby.com. This is his current book, The Color of Compromise. And we're talking about racism. And Jemar, I really want to ask you something that I've been struggling with as of late, and that it was pointed out to me by a pastor that the whole idea of race is rooted in evolutionary science. The idea that we all come from a common ancestor, but evolved along lines that we call race. So blacks, or however you want to phrase it, Africans, evolved a certain way. Asians evolved a certain way. Some of the earlier ones actually had 4 groups, but now they kind of reduced it to 3. And of course, the white people evolved to a higher level, smarter, more whatever. And that is obviously in contrast to Scripture, which says that we all are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. And so I look at the science of race, which, up through Morton and Darwin, and even last year in the New York Times there was an article talking about this, perpetuating this idea. And I think, my gosh, have we, because I grew up, I was taught this in school, in biology, in public school, in high school. I think a lot of Christians have accepted that there are differences between the races genetically, which is a straight up evolutionary idea and absolutely not biblical. And so what I'm struggling with right now, and I'm really glad you're here today as someone who's a student of history as well as a student of the Bible, is race even right? I mean, should it even be a word that we ever use?
Right. Okay, so I'm so glad you asked this. There's a lot to unpack here. Let me zoom out and take a macro view, and then we'll hone in a little bit. So in my view, I would say there have been at least 3 justifications for not just racial classification, but sort of implicit in that is a racial hierarchy.
Well, yeah, naturally, yeah.
Yeah. So the first, and these aren't completely linear or chronological, they overlap and mix, but the first main category of racial hierarchy derived from theology. And so you have people making sort of cosmological arguments that God created people who look different as essentially different. And so there were even debates in the 15th and 16th century whether people of African descent had souls and whether they should be evangelized, or were they simply, basically a step above the beast, and it's made for work. More often was arguments like the so-called curse of Ham, right?
Right.
Where theologians use very specious arguments to say that Shem, Ham, and Japheth were sort of the originators of the different races, from Jewish or Asiatic people to people of African descent to people of European descent, and then created a hierarchy based on that one passage from Genesis. And so that's sort of a theological argument. Then what you're talking about, the sort of biological argument or the evolutionary argument, which really became popularized in the 19th century, especially the latter half of the 19th century, which says, well, we're learning all this stuff about science and about evolution, and the fact that people are different is really just a matter of their context and their environment. And it just so happens that people of European descent are the most advanced, and people of African descent or any darker skinned people, well, they're just not quite as advanced. And that's no offense, it's just biology.
I know. Oh yeah, no offense there. Oh,
right. Isn't that funny how it works out though? And then I would say the latest iteration is the cultural argument. So now people would 100% agree with you that all people are made in the image of God. We are ontologically equal. People would 100% agree with you that, scientists with the genome mapping project have shown we have literally 99.9% of our DNA in common.
Yes.
And from a scientific perspective, we couldn't reproduce across racial lines if we were that different. So that argument is, but now is the sort of cultural pathology argument. Well, there's just something wrong with their culture. It's something wrong with their values. It's something wrong with their morality. That's the dissolution of the Black family. That is, they're prone to criminality. All of these things which seem rooted in fact, but in fact are subtle forms of racism. Because what you're saying is that these people groups, whoever you're referring to, as a community, don't have a culture that is as moral or advanced or as capable of success as others. And so that's a more sophisticated and subtle argument, but it's still there. So all of these things, like, I don't even know how to have a conversation with someone who really believes there are like biological differences between races. Like, that is just such antiquated thinking. I'm like, I don't know where you begin to deconstruct that thinking. I think a lot more challenging and troublesome are sort of cultural pathology arguments that would lump people together.
Right.
Yeah.
No, okay. So, and that's where a lot of my struggle has been, because obviously I talking to different people with darker skin, and I think I would prefer, as I work through this, to use more of an ethnic reference, because we certainly, and it's scripture, ethnos is in the scripture. So, you know, people of African descent, I think that's fair. You know, African American, Irish American, Italian American, whatever. That does identify sort of some of what we legitimately are. But my point being that I talk to different African Americans, and I get a wide range of views. They're, you know, no people group is monolithic in their thinking.
That's right.
But when I talk to one African American who may not agree with other African Americans that may be in the majority, I don't even know. I haven't taken a survey. Mm-hmm. I am told, well, they have a white perspective, and I go, what do I do with that? Mm. How do I navigate? You know, right. To me, I would want to default back to, look, we're all people. We're people. Let's just start even right there. We're people. We have different ethnic backgrounds, yes. As Americans, the melting pot, I mean, it's really diverse. But we try to pigeonhole people and say, well, you're white, so you're going to think like this, and you're black, so you got to think like this. And to me, all that is race-based, which is a false concept, and it just falls apart. And I think that's, when we live there, it seems like that may be part of the reason we just keep spinning our wheels and not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Help me out here. You're the expert.
Well, you know, my perspective is this. So race is socially constructed, which all that means is what we just talked about. It's not rooted in theology or biology. It's something that, you know, as a society was created. People had certain definitions, and they sort of foisted that upon other people, so on and so forth.
Was it not created strictly for basically power and what amounts to oppression?
Exactly.
Okay.
That being said, race is socially constructive doesn't mean that race is imaginary or that it doesn't have tangible effects. And furthermore, race nowadays refers to much more than just one's skin color or a particular classification on a census survey. It actually comes with a lot of history. And so this is where I disagree with the colorblind idea. Okay. Number one, Jesus healed blindness. So I don't know if blindness is a virtue in a lot of ways. But number two, when one says they're colorblind, I understand the sentiment. That means they want to treat all people equally, no matter what they look like or whatever their race. I get that sentiment. The problem is, number one, the world doesn't work like that. And number two, when you don't see my color, particularly as a black person, what that does is it creates this sort of docetic dualism between body and spirit. Like, bodies don't matter as much. I'm an embodied soul, right? And so the way God made me and how I look is part of that. So I don't want you to miss that part of image bearing in me. Sure. And then number two, there's a whole history and culture that goes along with being Black and an experience. And so for you to say, well, I don't see color, means in many ways you don't see me. Because there's so much of who I am that it has been birthed in this experience, right or wrong. These are the categories that we've had, and so much of who I am, it comes from identifying as Black. And I want that to be part of the discussion, because here's the problem. Here's the crux of it: is if we don't see color, then we don't talk about color, and we don't acknowledge reality, and we don't talk about truth, and therefore we can't get to real reconciliation.
Yeah, I agree. Again, I am walking this road, so I'm just thinking that it seems like we need to address color as culture, not as some sort of genetic or theological or other false hierarchy and division. In other words, when Jesus came in, he walked into a place that was very culturally divided. And what did he do? He went right to the Samaritans, which were the racially impure, the mongrels of their society, and validated them. Yeah. So I don't know. It's been an interesting journey. Let me ask you, this is one of my favorite questions. The analogy I use is if I'm driving a car, I've got a blind spot, and it's a blind spot that you can hide a truck in.
Yep.
And if someone else in the car points out my blind spot, they're not necessarily criticizing my driving, although that does happen. No names will be named. But if I will listen, they may save my life.
Right.
What do you think is sort of a common blind spot for, I even hate using this term, maybe I shouldn't, I may be overreacting, but for white people in the church, what do you think maybe a common blind spot is?
Yeah. And by the way, I think referring to those categories is fine, as long as Christians we understand the social construction of them and the biblical basis of the image of God and all of that. It's just the lingua franca.
I get it, but the world doesn't understand that, and that's where I struggle with it. And seriously, because when you say white to certain people or Black, they hear one thing, but you and I can say it and we hear totally different thing because we have that scriptural basis. Yep. So the language is difficult. Anyway, please go answer the question.
So a big blind spot is the idea that race does not have to do with your intentions, but with impact. So racism in particular. And so here's the difference. And this is just a human trait. It's not really a white trait or anything. We want to look at ourselves in the most positive light.
Sure.
And so when something happens and it could be interpreted as racist, most people would say, well, I didn't mean it that way.
Yeah.
Like, if you knew my heart, or let me just explain, yeah, I get it, but what is the impact of your words or your actions? So just to take the blind spot analogy, if you have a car in your blind spot and you change lanes and you hit that other car, guess what? It was not your intention to hit the other car.
Right.
But now my headlight's busted. So we have to deal with impact, not just intentions here. And you may be the nicest person in the world, but guess what? Because of this blind spot, whether it was unintentional or not, there's still been harm done. And that's what we need to deal with. Number two, the big blind spot is understanding racism in its systemic and institutional dimensions. And I think, if we zoom out, it makes a lot more sense than maybe the current discourse has it. But if you have literal centuries of an entire people group being enslaved, and we cannot underplay the brutality of this institution that separated husbands and wives and brothers and sisters and children and parents, that increased a plantation owner's quote unquote property in people through rape, systemic and years long rape, that never financially compensated laborers who, we were talking before we started recording, I'm in the Delta, it is 90 degrees by 9 a.m. And I literally drive through cotton fields on my way to the University of Mississippi, and to be out in those fields laboring from camp to camp, as they said, from can't see in the morning till you can't see at night,
Mm.
without being paid, and then never being compensated thereafter. No, nobody got their 40 acres. Nobody got their economic self-sufficiency. Having to transition into sharecropping or leave the South altogether in what you could call a refugee movement because of the terrorism and the economic exploitation that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about those centuries of oppression, do we really think everything's going to be fixed in a matter of a few years or even a few decades? And that's the idea of systemic and institutional racism, just that inequality has a momentum all its own. And that, guess what? People with racist ideas didn't suddenly vanish,
Right.
you know?
Right.
They were there even after the Civil War. Guess what happens in 1865 and 1866? The birth of the Ku Klux Klan. Guess
Right.
what happens in 1915? The rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. Guess what happens in the 1950s and 60s? The rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. And those were just the more overt folks who put on robes and hoods. There were
Right.
plenty of people, who, as I try to show in my book, who saw that and effectively stood by and watched it happen, if not approved of it. So my whole point is a huge blind spot that I think would really help us if we could see this more clearly, is that racism manifests itself in healthcare, in education, in incarceration, in voting rights, in basically any quality of life factor you can think of. It falls predictably along racial lines, and that's where we need to move and make progress.
Couldn't agree more with you. Absolutely. I need to let you go. I know, and I would just continue this conversation. One question I do have, and I think it's a critical one. Are you familiar with Joe Fagan and the systemic racism? Yes, President of American Sociological Association, I think, something like that. Now he's down at Texas A&M, but he's written a lot about the idea of systemic racism, and his solution to that is to start over with the foundational authority of the country. In other words, reconvene a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution. Basically, well, my question would be to you: Is the nation, America, the United States of America, is it redeemable, or are you of the thought that is being pushed in the streets right now in some quarters that no, we have to, because the foundation is faulty, we have to scrap the whole thing and start over?
Yeah. Okay, so two things. One, if you study the history, I can virtually guarantee you the story is going to be worse than you expected and not better. Right. When it comes to race, right? You're not going to be pleasantly surprised when you study history, whether it's of the church or just the nation in general, right? And so if that's the case, then we have to start saying, well, what do we do about it? And the other thing you notice when you study history is that it goes as far back as you can go. You know, it didn't start at the Constitutional Convention in the 1790s. It didn't start with the Declaration of Independence in the 1770s. It goes all the way back to European contact with North America in the 15th century. And so there was never a period where we, quote unquote, got it right. But the other thing I would say is, the founders probably knew better than they did when they wrote those documents. I think most people would agree with the sentiment that all people are created equal and are endowed by their creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a sound principle, but we have not lived up to that principle. And so I think what the man you're referring to is right in the sense of the scope of the project. Right? It's not going to be fixed by these little tweaks here and there. We need to have something on the scope of a constitutional convention. I don't know if that's what it is, but something of that magnitude. And I think in the church, we need to have something on par with like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whether that's done by denomination or what have you. But we need to be thinking in those big terms we need to be thinking comprehensively about what it means to fight racism, especially in its systemic and institutional form. So whatever we think of, we're not going to err on the side of it being too big or too foundational, too significant.
Yeah, I like to look at sports, and I don't know that there is a major sport in our country that wasn't segregated, at least to begin with, if not for a very short time. The NBA before the ABA merged with it, but football, baseball, but yet those were places where they addressed the issues earlier than the rest of society.
Yeah.
And I look at it now, and I'm not saying that, there obviously issues pop up. Colin Kaepernick has been a focal point for a lot of that. But as far as coming together and being a team and striving for some equality, and again, there are disagreements to be had and battles to be fought, but it would seem like as long as we keep moving in the direction of, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, doing what we put on paper from a national standpoint, I can't think of a better place to be than the constitutional foundation we have, some of the democratic elements of representation that we have. I don't know, look around the world and I don't see a better place, honestly, a better system.
Yeah.
Are we going to be okay if we keep on this course?
I just think the time for big moves is now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what people are waiting for if they're not doing what you're doing, which is being on this journey, asking questions and being willing to make changes.
Yeah.
If you're not willing to do that right now, I don't know what sort of movement or sign you're waiting for. Like, it's here. I'm just here to tell you. If you needed the sign, I'm letting you know it's right here. Now is the time to change, and we cannot overestimate the level and the depth of change. So yeah, 100% agree. If we can live up to sort of these democratic ideals, I think where we fall short is people underestimate what that actually requires as far as change. And there are still plenty of people who don't want to see it. And that's, we're going to have to figure out a way around that or persuade them.
Absolutely agree. Jemar Tisby, wonderderful conversation. You want to do this again anytime, you let me know when your book comes out, especially in January. It's slated for right now. I want to point out your book, The Color of Compromise. It's available now. You can go get it. I'll point out the website, jemartisby.com. Also, his organization called The Witness, and the website's thewitnessbcc.com. He hosts a podcast that's called Pass the Mic. Anything else I'm missing, Jemar, that I want to point out for you? Because I really want to give you a voice here.
You hit all the high notes. I appreciate that.
Okay. So do check all those things out. And guys, we just got to keep moving forward. We got to keep making progress. I'm not perfect. None of us are perfect, but it's okay as long as, I think, again, the foundational space is within the church with the Bible as our foundation. The gospel is our only hope as a people, as a nation. Let's keep hammering this. Let's keep moving forward. Jemar, it's been a really an honor and a pleasure having you here, and I do hope we can talk again. I know if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, please let me know. I'll pick you up at the airport. We'll go to lunch or coffee or something. But I'd love to just keep the dialogue going, man.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Love being on the show.
Thank all you guys for watching. Please share this. If you haven't subscribed already, any of these channels, or followed the channel, depending on the social media platform you're on, do it now. We got more great interviews, and share this. We'll see you again next time on Life Today Live.
We have an opportunity to make America a better nation. All we say to America, all we say to America, all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper.